Good morning, everybody. Howdy. So, you might notice that I'm not Sergey Bratus. He's hiding out back, and he has lots of long Russian stories to tell. And if you ask him politely, at the bar afterward, he'll tell you more long Russian stories, and you'll learn all sorts of cool stuff. You'll learn that fingerprinting isn't useless. You'd be surprised. You learn all sorts of fun stuff. And at the same time, you get these nifty drink tickets. So when you take them to the bar and you get your free beer, it's a matter of etiquette. Do you or do you not tip on that beer? Yes. Do you tip normally or extra graciously because you're not paying for the beer? Thank you kindly. Here's Sergey Bratus.
Thank you, neighbor. Thank you. Yeah, now that we're clear on the protocol, we may proceed. I'm Sergey. It's great to be here. I am really pleased to see this thing, which I never thought I'd see outside of my basement again. Yeah, at the bar, I will tell you a story about how I owned one and how it was worth a monthly salary and how I lent it to a friend, and then this friend started avoiding me because he didn't want to give it back. And so I had to waylay him while he was saving files onto it and reclaim my precious floppy. Well, yeah, I mean, this is, believe you me, this is as close as it gets when the closest place you can buy those things is like 500-600 miles away. So, I'm going to rant today on something that's very near and dear to my heart. The place of offense in the grand scheme of things. So I work for a college, right? You can see the little, well, you can't, but hey. And occasionally I go to academic conferences, and the attitude that you get there is offense, you. Or, oh, yet another attack paper. And this is changing, luckily, but there is still quite a bit of that out there. And we might actually, you know, who said you can't quote a tweet? Let's quote a tweet, right? So here's John Lambert of Microsoft, who posted a series of tweets that are each worth a paper. That's one of them. If you shame attack research, you misjudge its contribution. Offense and defense aren't peers. Defense is offense's child. So this is the point that I'm going to argue, hopefully with some good stories. But then, of course, immediately it attracted a response from Marcus Renum, who is another great old security guy. And he said, coevolution is the answer, right? And the question is stupid. And I actually maintain that John Lambert in this one has it. Because coevolution is this strange thing, right? When you say coevolution, you imply something like this, right? So here is this bird with his beak completely useless, except for reaching into this flower. And so they sort of reshaped each other somehow strangely. Or maybe this is just some sort of a weird joke, right? And, you know, maybe it's coevolution, but what is coevolving exactly, right? And how is it getting there? Any problems?
We need to adjust the audio for the other track. They can't hear you at the moment.
Okay. Well, hey, the projector dance continues. Never ends. So here's the thing. Is this, I mean, there is certainly an arms race. There is certainly offense chasing defense, chasing offense. But are they really as random and meaningless as the birdie and the flower? I say no. And it's not just adaptation, which just takes you down some weird path while you could have gone in many others. Again, this is what I claim. And when you ask me what is co-evolving and what is going on, I would say what is evolving. I would say our knowledge of the universe. Our knowledge of the universe, of what computers actually do, and how we can actually build one that we could finally trust. Because obviously we can't trust the current breed. And so what's the shape of this problem, right? It's like the five blind men philosophers and the elephant, right? So, you know, what is security, right? What is the shape of the beast? Is it pen testing? Is it the App Store? You will notice the snake and the apple must be somewhere nearby, right? Or is it the strong foundation, the crypto? Or is it the policy, which is just kind of like hanging down on the side? Or is it firewalls? Or is it the fancy user experience thing? And, you know, of course, you hear a lot of talks, people commenting on what is security, what is a security elephant. Well, actually, it's kind of sort of like this, right? So the whole problem with computing is that we don't actually know what we're dealing with, and it's much, much bigger than we can imagine, and it's much, much more complicated. And so we're sort of groping around and not even finding the interesting pieces. Okay, if you will. So yeah, enjoy the elephant, right? Enjoy the elephant, which I blatantly stole from a genius artist. So here is this little rundown on what offensive computing is, according to me. The problem is that we are really, really bad at predicting the behaviors of the systems that we build. And there are good mathematical reasons for that, which I will touch upon later. But basically, the problem is that we build a thing, and it turns out to be a completely different thing with emergent programming models, which attackers immediately take advantage of, and with emergent trust properties, which we know as being pwned. And offensive computing is actually feeling out the shape of that beast, of the actual beast, and the diff between that and what we think we built. And so there are three major reasons why this is actually a science, right? First, it reveals the mechanisms. This is the most interesting thing about any exploit. It's not what kind of a system you compromised. It's not, you know, what the impact on the power grid or something else would be. It's, if you ask me and Travis, it's what the mechanism of that thing is. What is it that you programmed that wasn't supposed to exist in the first place? And then, of course, from that, we get to the point that you think this is a feature, you think this is a bug, but actually designers almost never think right. And it's offensive computing that shows what they actually designed. And finally, when you have this exploit computation, it goes through those illegal states that the system is not even supposed to be in. These states make up a universe. Offensive computing discovers that universe. And this is actually very, very close to what the grand old mathematics does, and the branch of it that became computer science. So up top is Hilbert, David Hilbert, a mathematician who, instead of solving grand problems, actually formulated them, and his contribution through that was much better and bigger, and lasted, you know, is still lasting for us. And one of his problems was, can we build a machine that can prove mathematical theorems? You put a theorem in, you find out on the other end if it's actually true or not. And if it is, then you get the proof. And that started a gentleman down on the bottom, Alan Turing and Alonzo Church, exploring trivial rewriting systems. So think algebra, think rewriting formulas. What if you could have a thing that would rewrite formulas very precisely, very dumbly, and very, very fast? Would that thing be able to fill David Hilbert's order? And out of that emerged the fact that we all intuitively know. They call it undecidability. We call it that you can't automatically find bugs, and you can't automatically find all bugs and vulns, just because such a program that would go out and for any program find all the bugs in it would be impossible. This is proven. This is a grand mathematical result, again attributed to Turing, which actually gave the name to the Turing machine, which is our most powerful computing model. But again, this is something that we know and love every day, because that's basically why you can't put a program through a ringer and have all the bugs sort of distilled out of it and found out. Exploits are actually proofs. So you may have heard me say this before. You're all mathematicians. Because an exploit is proof that a computation that is not supposed to exist actually exists. You're writing a program for the machine that wasn't supposed to be there but is. So sometimes they are as powerful as can ever be. We don't care if it's just one memory override that gives you a root shell. You don't care that you can write any program and compile it into those combinations of bugs. But we don't yet know how to find those things in any large quantity. But every one we find is precise, because you can't argue with the root shell. Once the exploit is written, it is not evidence, it is proof in the mathematical sense that the thing is there and that there is actually an extra leg or an extra cluster of trunks on the beast. So methods. I'm going to tell you 3 tales that I think are important, in which they show that this so-called coevolution is not actually random, and it's actually a scientific process that converges to something much larger than just funny shapes matching other funny shapes. So the first thing is that the features, security measures, when introduced, are almost always mislabeled. So you think it protects against X, but it's actually something completely different. And again, the real meaning of a security measure is only found when it's circumvented. And at that point, it does not become useless, because a sword does not become useless because of a gun. But it's just useful. It turns out just exactly when it is useful, for what tactics, at what quarters. Then you have that circumvention, or you have that exploit, and there is a really good bet that the thing that you have found is already out there. And so again, we'll see a story about that. And then finally, if somebody has designed something which is security critical and put it right in the middle of the system, chances are that they did it for power management or remote administration or something else. But in fact, they just created a huge security hole, and eventually that security hole will become a security feature. So we'll talk about that as well. So here is a technology that was created by hackers, tested by hackers, deployed by hackers, and then eventually became a part of your standard Windows system. And it all goes back to the point that just the push EBP, move ESP EBP, and the ret and the leave in front of it, these things together are a machine. The program for that machine is your stack. And people realized that a long, long time ago in 1990s. LF1 was not the first one to invent it, but he was the first one to describe it properly. And then what happened in the next couple of years was non-executable stacks. Back then, of course, the NX bit did not exist. So people emulated it. OpenWall, Solar Designer, and PAX, the PAX team, Pipach, emulated the NX bit. That should give you a pause, right? That major feature, which eventually became a part of the platform, was actually deployed by like 2 guys, separately from each other, apparently. And then people found ways to actually bypass that. So you have your return-oriented programming, which got that name like 8 years after it was invented, described, documented in FRAC. So the academic community woke up to this because Hovav Shacham, in an amazing hack, an amazing social engineering hack, proved that oh, pieces of libc could be Turing complete. And then academia took notice. Prior to that, they were largely unaware of ROP, which by then existed since 2000. And now, of course, you have thousands of papers written about ROP and JOP and whatever have you. Any instruction in x86 can be a basis for oriented programming, like move-oriented programming. How about that? Except, if you look, when DEP was introduced, it was introduced as a protection against buffer overflows. Just think about that. This is a quote from Microsoft's own Service Pack 2 release notes. Isn't this weird, right? So we know that it does absolutely nothing to protect against buffer overflows. And in fact, ROP, well, or, the frame chaining technique that Frag published in 2000 and Hera of core security disclosed on BugTrack at about a few months earlier. It completely put to rest the misconception that DEP was a protection against buffer overflows. No, it broke one particular technique in which you just took the return address and put the code on the stack and jumped to it. Yet, this is my first point. When a protective measure is introduced, it is most likely mislabeled. And we don't know what it does until it is circumvented. So how about this story? Remember Stoned? I do, because I infected my PC with it back in the day with the help of this thing, right? So back then, your PC would boot from just about anything you forgot in the drive. If a friend of yours gave you a disk with a game and the boot sector contained the Stoned thing, well, yeah, your PC was seriously stoned, and that's how you learned about the master boot record. And then that was in like 1980 something, 1985, 1987, and then it went away because you could compromise Windows and load things into Windows at absolutely, at absolute ease, using all of the Windows programming tools and all of the Windows system support. And you did not need to monkey around with the MBR. Except later, that thing came back. It's like the return of the king, right? Well, the anti-king, anti-pope, something like that. So Microsoft started signing their modules and started checking the signature. And so how do you get around that? Well, of course, you start your infection before Windows actually starts itself. So suddenly, this 1987 technique was back with a vengeance. And that knowledge of the MBR that became lost, it's again, this sort of Lord of the Rings theme, you come on a city, a ruined tower somewhere, and yeah, great kingdoms used to be here. Well, so now they're back. And this is great if you're playing offense or if you are dissecting those things for a living. But how did we actually find out about them? How did we find out that it came back? Well, it was a couple of proof of concept presentations at Black Hat. One of them was even describing a thing called Stoned, although it should have been called, Stone Reloaded or Stoned Reborn or something like that. And if you look at the timeline, these things developed into bootkits. But basically, the first of them were found in the wild when we actually figured to look. And that was after the bootkit POC was shown. Same deal with more interesting x64 things like Almaric, TLD4, and other bootkits. Again, first you see the proof of concept. You have the offensive security do its thing, explore yet another part of the beast, yet another corner of the universe, and then you start looking for these things in the wild, and lo and behold, they are there. Guess what? We're discovering a thing that actually exists. We're the blind man with the elephant. Now, this is my favorite story. SMM, and I confirmed it by talking to people who actually hacked it and are working on it for Intel. That feature, which now we know as the layer -1 or layer -2 or one of those, you know, the arcane security cornerstone of the whole system, it was introduced as a power management feature. So imagine, you can hijack any calculation, any computation. You can have a state in which you can examine your caches even, and your memory is weirdly remapped. And all of this is done to make your battery run a little longer. Yeah, people will pay money for that. So it was power management, admin, inventorying, and that kind of thing. Totally outside of the security domain. So attackers figured out its actual execution model and its actual relation to the rest of the system. The people who designed it had no idea of these things. And then, seeing the slaughter that was done to security of platforms with SMM, then the designers actually redesigned it and reinvented as a security feature. And this is a very, very interesting and cautionary story. So first things get invented, then they get mislabeled, then they get actually studied by offensive people, then they get redesigned to actually become security features. So here's the timeline. Loic Duflot in 2006 used SMM to bypass OpenBSD secure levels. So yeah, OpenBSD. People are looking to get in trouble there. And just basically, you know, what is an OpenBSD secure level, right? Okay. Yeah, it's nice to have a paranoid system. It's interesting that the paranoid system is actually the first target and the canary, because of course, you know, who doesn't like making fun of that kind of thing? I don't know. So then, as usual, we quote frac, and we quote frac again. And you know, you go by the book and the verse, and this is your BS daemon on the system management mode hacks. And then Sherry Sparks writes a first SMM rootkit, and then there's another FREC article on this, and then Joanna Rutkowska expands on that mightily with a cache trick in which you can talk to the other memory and you can confuse the main computation as you switch back and forth through the caches. So this is a very graceful result. Again, out of these results, the model of the thing is eventually assembled. It's not there when the thing is introduced. And then finally, you have all of the security architecture that was built on top of that once it was realized just how important this was and how central to security it was. The authentication variables and the trusted BIOS and the other SMM work out of MITRE, and of course, all of the viruses and all of the things like the flea and the tick and other things that Zinokova, Corey Cullenberg, and others showed. And so you never get to know the beast until you actually spend a whole lot of time around it. And let's hope you just like the feel of what you're finding. Usually you do, right? That's why you stay in the area. So here is my point. Offense is defense's parent because offense defines the universe in which defense lives. So let's look at this from two different angles. One angle is the familiar exploit development. You have the programmer's model. In the programmer's model, functions never get jumped to in the middle of. don't know how to express it better, right? Right? And instructions are where you put them. And if you didn't put that instruction in memory, it's not there. No, wrong, because of course you can jump into the middle of an instruction and on x86, and then ARM even made it a feature, like with thumb. Right? So, and of course, there are, I mean, I've talked to some computer science professors who were unaware of ARM and thumb being the sort of the good brother and the evil brother. Right? So, yeah. Then there is the binary representation, which is what we know and love. Gadgets, overwrites, out-of-type references, all of that, all of the memory corruption that you can make serve your program, that you actually program and chain up the bugs and the bits and the features to actually make your exploit. And then, of course, there is the physical representation, which is even worse. There is crosstalk. There are things like row hammer, right? There are things like packet-in-packet, which I will revisit. And it just turns out that the universe that you thought you plumbed and you thought you knew, it just suddenly expands in bursts. So offense defines the universe in which defense lives, and it doesn't just define it, it expands it. There are no relevant variables in defense that are not derived from offense's exploration of that universe. So think of spelling bee, right? Can you use this word in a sentence? This is your best test for what this word actually means, which is why it's used in spelling bees, because children are really good about remembering gibberish and giving back gibberish, and this has been basically the nature of education for as long as I can remember myself. People who are older, right, you tell me if it was like that before. And very, very rarely you can actually, you're lucky enough to find a teacher who doesn't just want you to regurgitate, but to understand. And then, of course, for math, this is, we know this, that you don't actually understand the figure, you don't actually understand a fact until you use it in a proof. And math without proofs is a profanation of math. It's like the worst thing that could happen to the civilization. And I'm sure it happened before to many other civilizations, which is probably why, working hypothesis, they are former civilizations. Because regurgitation costs, right? I posit that you don't understand a bug or a feature until you can use them in an exploit by the same general principle of how things work. So are all bugs shallow, given a sufficient number of eyes? Like, hell no, right? Bugs are not even understood until they are exploited. And of course, as you know, there are problems that are NP-hard, NP-complete. You cannot solve them until you try just about every combination of things. Our eyes are not really good at doing that, no matter how many you bring to the job. So this pronouncement that all bugs are shallow given enough eyes may be true when we evolve a separate brain for solving NP-complete, NP-hard problems or doing search of infinite spaces really, really fast. Otherwise, no, right? And bugs are just bugs, yeah, sure. And an instruction set architecture is an instruction set architecture. And of course, your move, which can be actually used to write any program, and just a bunch of move, look up the mobfuscator. Well, an instruction is just an instruction. So you don't understand it until you've actually seen it used in a thing called a weird machine. I coined the term. I have to admit to that. But Hallerflake, Thomas Dalian, actually gave it the recognition, which I do not believe it may have deserved. But anyway, I gave a talk at the German conference, and after that we talked about how these things are all math, and he is, of course, a better mathematician than I am. And in his Infiltrate talk, he explored this, and he said that exploitation is setting up, instantiating, and programming the weird machine. And that's exactly what it is. And I should have said that. Right? So you have that state which the system can be in, but shouldn't be in. And this is why people who do functional programming say illegal state should be unrepresentable. And there is wisdom in that. And this is what in the LangSec community, my other thing, this is what we describe as the state should be explicit or eliminated. You should be able to examine it, you should be able to understand it, or you have to kill it. I'm sorry. It's just either this or not trusting your computer anymore forevermore. And then your exploit is actually a machine, a state machine, ticking between those illegal states and transitioning between them, just like in college they tell you about the finite automata. And yeah, that's a great model. That's exactly what an exploit does. It's just that the automaton it is written for is in your code, but you don't know about it. And this is not really all that different from the CPU. And I'm just quoting from those slides because I love them so much. Like I said, I should have written them. So it's not different from any CPU. You've got a really weird move that moves this thing over there and this thing over here and corrupts that memory over there. And then you compensate, just like the Rubik's Cube. You turn it and you turn it and you turn it and you think that you completely destroy the order, but then you turn it a couple more turns and then suddenly it turns out that you just swap those two cubes on the on the opposite ends, which is what you wanted to do. And so this is how these things work. So there is this normal intended functionality, and then there is the unintended, the weird, the illegal, and yet you can program it. You can program it either precisely or probabilistically. So you try this so many times and it works. So there is this enormous universe of the state of our computing systems that we have not yet plumbed, that we do not yet know, that we do not yet understand. Offense is our fleet of discovery. Just think sci-fi, think colonizing space. Think of yourself exploring a technology as basically boarding one of those ships that takes you away forever so that you could discover a planet and settle it and, you know, maybe in 1,000 years have a war back with Earth, right? Right? This is what offense does. Yeah, we're a long way away from the beast, but then of course you think Lovecraft, you think all those entities existing in space, and so the metaphor kind of comes back together, right? Enormous entities in the center of the universe gibbering madly in assembly code. And of course, how do we know the universe expands? Well, we can kind of observe it, right? So in 1990s, you had those wonderful tricks, Solar Designer, Return to Libc, Tim Newsham, how to combine those two things, how to chain them. Then Hera and others, and then the Frack article, which is a great article. So this is a 2001 by Nurgle, has great poetry, which is what you really appreciate in a science paper, which is what you used to find in the great science papers. Yeah, not anymore, because science just became the sort of a buttoned-up exercise. Yeah, good luck. Anyway, so then, boom, that universe expands. And we have the things like a poisoning kernel from user space, described by GRSecurity packs and protected by UDRF. And then finally, we get things like SMAP, noticed by the major operating systems, hopefully entering into the main line again after years of being invented and tested out by hackers, who emulated the hardware that should have been doing this because the hardware was just not doing it, right? One of the best tricks to understand the older x86 MMU before the level 3 TLB cache, before the STLB that converged the ITLB and DTLB lookups, is to look up how no exec in PAX was implemented. It's a wonderful exploration of the extra space in that space machine. And this is exactly what it is. This is how it's written. You know, mathematicians come in all walks of exploration, not just in math. And then, you know, these days we have interesting stuff with weird machines everywhere, and the universe is still expanding, right? So with Neighbor Travis, we've done our little bit for blowing up the universe of digital radio. So imagine if we told you, if you heard a few years ago that you must have a radio to inject raw frames into a digital radio file, you would have said yes. I would have said yes, right? I mean, radio is this kind of a black box, and with modulation and whitening and who knows what else, and you just don't. You know, you need to buy that radio. And if that radio is not available for sale, then your PHY is secure. Your Wi-Fi is secure because you can't just buy a card that can inject an arbitrary frame. Yeah, right. That became known as the month of kernel bugs. When people realized that, yeah, you can hack up those things, and then you can push out a probe request that crashes your kernel or takes it over. Gone with 60 seconds was the talk that used an Atheros on the Mac, but you know, many others followed. And so this is false. Here's another one. Bytes can only be received if sent as such. So I send you, you know, an A7, and you receive an A7, and if you receive like an A6, then that's because I sent an A7, right? And noise kind of maybe stepped on it, but you'll catch that with the frame control sum. No. You can actually send frames which have absolutely no symbol in common with the frames that the receiver will actually receive. So the packet-in-packet trick, which was predicated on the noise always being there, and stepping on just a few symbols, just a few bytes of a transmission, and therefore interfering with reception of frames thusly. So you've got your bytes in the air, and you've got the circuit that's just catching them, catching them, catching them, catching them, catching them, but you don't know if that's a frame or not, because that's just bytes. So you have special bytes that mark the start of the frame, and then give the length of the frame, and then you know you are in the frame. So it's just like a regular expression, or SQLI. So this is exactly like SQLI, right? In your payload, you can include, for some PHYs, not others, a perfectly valid byte for byte image of a frame. Then, if the noise steps on this start of frame delimiter, start of frame delimiter, then how does the radio know that the frame begins? It doesn't. So if you include that kind of a thing in the payload itself, then the radio will see, there is the preamble, okay, and there is the start of frame delimiter, okay, so now we're in the frame, except we're way in the payload of the frame, which you can control without controlling a radio, which you could control being miles away, without an antenna. just by exchanging some traffic with whatever you have in that wireless LAN. And then it's got the right length and the right frame control. And, well, you know, you've received the frame, right? Turns out that this is not the end of it. You can actually shift the encoding of those symbols by 1/8 of a nibble. 1/8 of a nibble. Neighbor, if you're there, wave. Because this is an excellent result, right? A result that totally surprised me. And then it turns out that here's yet another misconception. Now, if you send the frame loud and clear, and there are compatible radios sitting around, they should all receive it, right? If one received it, then so should the others, right? Wrong. Because by varying the length of the preamble, you can actually have some chips miss the frame completely. Regardless of the noise level, regardless of the power, they could be sitting right there. It's just that they're matching, little matching automaton that's syncing on the preamble, then looking for the start of frame delimiter, then extracting the bytes out of the air into a buffer rather than discarding them. Just doesn't grok that. And so half of your chips of one manufacturer can get that, other half doesn't. Who knew? Well, we kind of had a hunch, which is why we started looking at the fingerprinting of those things. And when I first met the neighbor, he was like, fingerprinting is boring. And I'm like, no, it's not. And then we drank on it. And then we drank some more. And then we put in a couple of years of effort. And then it turned out that, yes, fingerprinting the receiver and matching that receiver's world is not boring at all. You can have receivers see things that are not there, like I see dead frames. Or maybe I don't see live frames. It's just that they are shapeshifter frames. They're spoken in a dialect that chip does not understand. And all of that came from this very basic idea that offense is just probing the universe. The calculation, the computation almost always is more complex than it is, than it seems, than it was designed, and you have to explore it to understand what's actually there. You never know when you hit an interesting trunk of that meta elephant. And so I have this metaphor for you. I don't know if you would agree with it or not, but I have to try. So people calculated things, people computed things since time immemorial. You know, ancient Babylon, which, you know, was an interesting culture, I'm sure. I mean, they could build things that, you know, you look at some of the homes today and you wonder, what have we lost of that ancient technology, right? Maybe that's because they used cuneiform. And then, of course, all over the place in the Arab world, you know, this is how many of the old mathematical tracts survived, and others were faked as having done so, and written by interpreters, translators, who actually, you know, passed them off as the old mathematical tract, whereas it contained their results. So publishing was interesting way, way back then. And of course, this is all over the world, great mathematical traditions all over the place. But all of those things, if you learn them the way they were taught, they were interesting properties of specific things. Say, how do you make the right triangle? Well, you take a triangle with the sides 4, 3, and 5, and you tie those knots on the rope, and you make a triangle out of them, and lo and behold, you've got the right triangle. And here, with that piece of rope, you've got yourself an angle. Excellent. Well, now you can build things or, you know, design them. And there were so many things about the different numbers and the different figures to know until this guy came along. And so quadratic equations were considered to be really tough because there were so many partial cases until Francois Viette introduced the language which we know as the language of algebra, and you could describe the computation just so. So that which you had to spend your life fasting and practicing wisdom and whatnot, now you can actually write it down for 6th graders, 7th graders. It puzzles me to no end how quadratic equations are managed to be made into the bugbear they are for so many people. Because now that, you see, this is like science, right? You really need a special kind of a preparation for this. So take an adult who knows how to read and likes it, presumably. Lock that adult in the room with children for years. So then, how come the children emerging after those years still don't know how to read and don't like it? Like, you can't do that with just your garden variety, tricks. You have to have the pedagogical science for that. You have to have degrees in this. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. I mean, children would actually learn to read and say thank you and, raid the bookstore or something. Same thing with math, right? We're far, far away from the times when different villages basically competed in who would make up a problem that the other village could not solve. Actual medieval stuff, right? Algebra. A way of exploring all possible values at the same time. And so with the quadratic expression, with the quadratic equation, of course there are some cases when the values are illegal and the equation does not solve. And then you get what you call complex numbers because people explored why. And because people explored those cases and actually came up with a more general description of them. I posit this is very much what we do with features and bugs in our systems. We explore why they do not work, and then we come up with a generalization of what is actually there and how it does work. And so we progress. So that we're not bending to reach into this strange funnel that is Windows or Linux or Mac OS. We are actually discovering the very bits and pieces of the structure of the universe. So that art of abstracting away, of dealing with the illegal things, and even finding out which ones are illegal, you have to have the general procedures. You have to have the general formulas for that. This is what offense is to defense. This is what algebra is to the rest of math. Certainly to arithmetic. And how do you represent that illegal state? Well, first you have to discover it. Then you have to poke around. Then you have to try to automate this. And then eventually you might actually get complex numbers which give you, the best shape of the wing for a plane. That was the application of this that I learned, although of course in my case it was not planes, it was things that burn their fuel in the first 5 minutes of their trajectory. Soviet stuff, space race, right? We're all like going into space, right? Well, no. We're actually kind of going up into space and then down on the other side of the ocean. Werner von Braun, the moon race, that kind of thing. It's interesting to know just what the arms race got us, all things considered. So, proofs, right? Here is a paper that was written in 1969. Which was our last best hope of achieving reliability, documentation, and compatibility. This is what we know as the software verification. How far are we in that? Okay, well, we're making progress. This is good. We found a lot of illegal space. We know how to describe it. So, you have a precondition, you prove things about the code, and then you're guaranteed to get the result. And there is a lot of math involved, like a lot of math involved. This is the proof for this program up top, doing division. I will publish the slides, you can look at it later. And then you sort of add 70 man-hours of that, and then you have a secure microkernel like SEL4. Last time I checked, it was not quite modeling the x86 MMU. People tell me it kind of sort of does now. Well, maybe another 70 years and we can have a microkernel we can trust, right? But here's what the universe looks like from the offensive point. You have proven it. It's correct. It's provably correct. The preconditions P, be they so many pages of dense symbolic stuff, formulas, you know, it's done. And then, of course, the question is, if you feed it something other than P, if you feed it something that is not in those preconditions for which it is proven, what will happen? What will that thing compute? Will it just crash? Will it reject it? Will it happily go and give you a root shell on you know, some other part of the beast? We don't know. So everything is an interpreter, and it's actually your data manipulating your program. It's a very different, it's the same, it's saying the same thing. Even if your program is correct, what will it do when it sees something that it was not supposed to execute? And this can happen because of the physical world. This can happen because of leaky abstractions. This can happen because of any way that we explore the offensive universe. And you know, we've done our little bit with my group looking at this. Well, we've shown that if you look at the relocation entries in just the ELF metadata and in PE and in Mac-O it's actually simpler, that you can compile any program into that data. Forget the code. It's just the symbol tables and the relocation tables. And your loader will happily execute any program for you. This is an assembly. And then, you know, by the time your code actually starts to run, it's too late. You've actually executed everything else that you wanted to execute. Same thing with exceptions. The exception handler is actually a virtual machine that is carried with any C, C++ program, certainly one compiled with GCC. And again, your main program does not matter. It's the exception handling information, which is actually bytecode, which is actually executed by that virtual machine that is going to be present in your address space. And then, you know, my last but not least, my most favorite one, if you control a bunch of descriptor tables on the x86 CPU, you can make it compute things. You can compile your program into tables by controlling those tables and nothing else. You will never successfully dispatch an instruction. You will start with a page fault, which will generate a double fault, which will fix up just enough for another page fault to kick in. And so it will continue ticking because, yeah, x86 is a complex architecture with a lot of legacy features, and it reads and writes memory. And what else do you need of the processor? Instructions are irrelevant. The academic world is actually waking up to this, and this automatic exploit generation makes this extremely valuable observation that the verification is, exploit is a verification problem. That proving of correctness has an evil brother, finding where proofs break, and that we call an exploit. This is a counter proof. This is a proof of the counter case. So like, yeah, evolution. You've got those beasts. And here is an elephant. That's another elephant. Its arch nemesis, of course, as everybody who has been into biology, medieval biology, knows, is the dragon. Because the dragons eat up elephants' eggs or something. Right? And then, you know, what is biology to you is weapons to others. So you can see a weaponized elephant here. Poor, stunted thing. You know, carrying that. That's maybe not so stunted. Maybe their horses are just way too big. Right? Weapons control. So I've been ranting about all of this expanding the universe, colonizing far worlds, and that sort of thing. And then there are, of course, people who are not very comfortable with that, right? And here we have something that is called the WASSENAAR arrangement. This is the thing that controls the sales of nukes and chemical weapons and parts for those to people we do not like the Soviets, I guess. Well, you know, well, we kind of sort of both like them and not like them. It's quite amazing, you know. You read history from some very esteemed historians, and you have this feeling that the US was somehow just, you know, going here, going there, and starting things all over the world. And the Soviet Union is not mentioned even once. So, like, who were, like, why is your question? And my question is, well, I actually kind of know how the Soviet Union operated. And yes, it was trying to take over the world, right? I learned this in school. And, you know, I learned the methodology for doing so. It was quite interesting. But, you know, then it's kind of being written out of history. And this is really, really surprising. But anyway, so WASSENAAR arrangement in 2013 has been applied to cyber weapons, right? Intrusion software. And do you know what intrusion software is? Intrusion software is what modifies the standard execution path. Now, you've got a debugger, right? What does it do? It modifies the standard execution path. It injects those instructions in there, external instructions to control the program. A hypervisor, what does that thing do? Same thing, right? An operating system. Well, yeah, I mean, your program causes a page fault. Well, what happens then? It's standard execution path. So, like, let's have an authority on standard execution paths. And we're so good at defining what they are. We have this thing antivirus, right? Which detects whenever the standard execution path is left, and it's just such a tremendous success. So I was making this argument over a phone call to people at the Department of Commerce who were charged by the people from the Department of State who negotiated this monster to implement it. And so, like, hey, you know, great news, right? We're protecting activists everywhere. We are killing this terrible intrusion software. You know what, but yeah, just go and tell Microsoft, Google, Cisco, and others that they can no longer talk to foreign researchers. Not even to foreign groups within the organization. Because, of course, arms control is a serious thing, right? It's a felony to break it. It's a felony even to talk about these things to unfavored nations and individuals. And yeah, this was the text of the actual agreement. And the Department of Commerce was not at all happy about implementing that. So not without pushback from the industry. Basically, they kind of woke up to it after the first round of public comment, came back with things like, what are you doing? You're killing the industry. You're basically depriving us of any way of doing meaningful things with computers. And you're just destroying any hope of computer security because, hey, you know, some of it is done by foreigners. So there was another round of public comment. And right now, after all of this and after the pushback, it is in limbo. It will be renegotiated by the same people who negotiated it in the first place. So there is more fun to come. But just so that you know, intrusion software, so they had this idea that, oh, you can exchange malware. So malware itself is not controlled. But things to analyze, generate, develop things that could be used to modify the standard execution path are. Now that's fun, right? So that's all of our reverse engineering and fuzzers and compilers, arguably. and all of those things. So yeah, that's what happens when you try to legislate technology for all the good reasons. So luckily, this is beaten back for the moment, but I advise you to keep your eye on this because this is a clear and present danger. And of course, Europe has its own thing. They are going to control 0 day. So like as a scientist, nominally, right? Everything we publish in physics, chemistry, any other technical area, that's usually novel. As in, it doesn't get published if it isn't. You know, you get back your paper and, you know, about how to make things work, and one of the comments is, this is not novel. IBM Systems Journal in 1960s did that. And that's it. Your paper is dead. It's not getting published in that conference because it's not novel. So all science is actually 0 day. It's about things that not known before. And they're going to control that. Good luck. So I will close with another favorite tweet of mine. A vulnerability is a theorem, a supposition that a software flaw is a risk. An exploit is a proof of that theorem. Proofs are important. And I've been saying these things in long periods, in long Russian sentences, which just go on and on and on. You know, this idea of a run-on sentence, let me assure you, in German or Russian writing, it doesn't kind of exist. Right? Read, as I was made to, read Marx's Das Kapital. Yeah, run-on sentences from the start, which is why it worked so well, apparently. But anyway, I was actually parsing up some text for my students to give them to, you know, use their Lisp foo on. And I downloaded The Wind in the Willows and Alice in Wonderland, all of those children's books. What do you know? Run-on sentences. It's just long sentences with many clauses. People used to write differently. But anyway, you know, tweets do it. And so to Dino goes the props for formulating this so concisely. Indeed, an exploit is a proof of the theorem that a software flaw is at risk. Proofs are important. So imagine what would happen if physics was deprived of its most important tool, conducting experiments. That would not be a nice world. And yeah, I will let you enjoy this thing about the deemed export. It's when you talk to someone who is not a citizen. That would make life in my lab very, very interesting. So, hey, but we beat back that attack on offense, and we can continue exploring the universe and the shape of the beast for now. And I leave you, my fellow mathematicians, my fellow explorers, my fellow arms dealers, with that. Thank you.